I'd like you to think about how you'd answer the following questions. How do scientists develop and then establish ideas about the natural world? To what extent can scientists be totally objective in their work? To what extent should they be totally objective in their work? What is a scientific theory? What is a scientific law? How does our confidence in scientific theories compare to that of scientific laws? I'd like you to note that none of those questions ask you about any particular science idea, but they are questions about science. They're questions about what we refer to as the nature of science. And by nature of science, we mean, what is science? How does science work? What are scientists like in their work? What might they be like when they're not at work? How do we know what we know? What's the character of scientific knowledge? My research and my teaching are directed at improving understanding of the nature of science in our science education efforts. We know from decades of research that students, the general public, policymakers, and sadly, many science teachers have significant misconceptions about the nature of science. They wrongly think that scientists follow a scientific method. You might remember the scientific method that you were required to memorize back in middle school and high school. They wrongly think that scientists, if it's good science, they have to be totally objective in their work. They wrongly think that theories are mere speculations, and if we had enough evidence, those theories would become laws. All of these are well-known misconceptions. And yet these ideas are widely held. These misconceptions have negative consequences. In research my colleagues and I conducted several years ago, we interviewed the general public, asking them questions like the ones that I started this talk with. But we also asked them questions about some fundamental science ideas, ideas that all of us were taught back in middle school, again in high school, and we went to the university, we were taught them again there. We asked them questions about the cell. We asked them questions about the structure of the atom. We asked them questions about the DNA. And they remember being taught these things. They'd say, oh, I remember being taught that. And they'd give us their best answer. But then we asked them, how confident are you that what you just told us is correct? And I can see some of you smiling, because you probably remember being taught those things too. And they told us, I don't think what I said is right. And they were correct. They weren't right. But when we asked them questions about the nature of science, they gave us answers. But when we asked them, how confident are you in what you just said is correct about that? They were very confident they were right, but they were not. And this is significant because we tend to not use knowledge that we know is incorrect in our decision making. But when we think we're correct in our thinking, we tend to use that in decision making. And again, these misconceptions, wrongly thought to be correct, have significant negative consequences. Let me list just a few. We know we have a difficult time encouraging many people to enter science and science-related fields because they oftentimes think this is what science is. They're wrong about that, and it does not look like an attractive field. We also know that students who misunderstand the nature of science have difficulty accepting a lot of science ideas. They don't make sense if you don't understand the nature of science and what scientists are up to. We know that teachers who misunderstand the nature of science have a difficult time teaching science well if they're trying to teach for conceptual understanding, for deep understanding. It might surprise you, just as a quick example. The law of pendulum motion, which we tend to teach often at middle school and high school, depends on ignoring how pendulum behave in the real world. It was derived mathematically. You'll never come to the law of pendulum motion by observing pendulum in the real world. And that doesn't make sense. But if teachers understand that, they can teach about that more effectively. Policymakers, the general public, using what they think is correct ideas about about scientists, about the nature of science, can make very uninformed decisions on important issues. Let me give you one example. Policymakers and the public look at climate change science. They look at the researchers doing that, and they say, that's not how science is supposed to work. but they're using their misconceptions about the nature of science in making that claim. That when you actually look at the way climate change scientists work, it's really no different than what Galileo was doing, what Newton was doing, what astronomers do. And so, informed decision making, and we've got to stop this mistrust of science that is impacted by misunderstandings of what science is and how it works. We've just got to stop this mistrust of science. My colleagues and I are working very hard to improve understanding the nature of science among students, teachers, and the general public. With National Science Foundation funding, we have created Science Stories, the story behind the science, that address fundamental science ideas, but how those ideas were developed and how they became established. And when people read the stories, which are freely available on the internet, they say, I had no idea science worked like that. That's really interesting. And so I'd like to leave you with these big ideas. First, the nature of science is really focusing on what science is, how science works, and other issues related to that. We know that misconceptions regarding the nature of science are extensive. We know that they are very damaging to decision making. And we also know that if we tell the story behind the science, we can change those misconceptions. Thank you.